to
There
start
it is.
talking.
That's
There
on.
you go.
All right. Well, this is a little bit of an odd place to be streaming. I think when we stream by Zoom, it seems more natural than this. But this is actually quite natural for me, by the way, because we do this all the time. For y'all up on the dais, it'll seem odd until you get used to it. So we'll have our work session today for, I think we had some early afternoon obligations by some redistricting advisory commission members, but we'll have it for 2 or 3 hours as long as we can go. And the idea was that today we would have both Steve Floyd here in the sand pit and Bob Bass here in the sand pit working on maps actively. If you want a line moved and want to see how the numbers move, then they can do it, hopefully, today, real time, and we can see how that works. The idea being that we would narrow our map ideas down and hopefully have 1 or 2 or 3 maps that we think are viable before this is all said and done. I say 1 with some hope and optimism. And if it ends up being more than that, then we're just trying to sort of narrow that down for the Commissioner's Court for their consideration on what is now projected to be November 9th on their agenda. If we can get a conversation to them by November 2nd, that would be strongly preferred. I don't know if we can or can't, but if we can get some map ideas to them either in court on the 2nd or at least electronically that they can start perusing and looking at, that would be great. Obviously, you all know, and I'll just say that for the purposes of the public stream today, that we have this coming weekend on Saturday, 2 community meetings, 1 in the morning, 1 in the early afternoon in precincts 1 and 2. Janice has worked hard to set up the locations for those. Hopefully those are going to stick. We have in the evenings on the Wednesday and Thursday of the next week, the 27th, 28th, Janice? Yeah. We have a community meeting in Precinct 3 and Precinct 4, respectively. So we're really going in order 1, 2, 3, 4 over the next week and a half or so to have community meetings. I know you all wanted to hustle and get map ideas maybe ironed out a little bit more before those community meetings so that we'd have something to talk about. So I will be quiet now and just let you all start. We have 5 out of the 7 commission members here. I think Steve Meyer and who else is missing?
Michelle Lopez.
Dr. Lopez
They're on their way.
is missing, but on her way and on his way. So they'll show up when they show up, but you all can get going.
How do we want to proceed?
Well, I know you all were supposed to maybe bring some map ideas. We could have those been syndicated. Have you all provided those to either one of these guys?
I've got it.
You, okay.
I haven't seen
And
it.
is Steve bringing?
Yeah, he's bringing.
Okay, so, Dr. Trahan, we can start with yours unless you want to wait.
This is going to be just over 30 stations of the process. It's going to be an iterative process where we're going to view maps, have conversations about maps that are presented. Is that format?
Unless you all conduct your own business yourselves, so unless you have a better idea, that's what I had in mind. Yeah.
Bob is hooked up. I don't know if he'd mind putting that in his.
Maybe you can download it and then I'll provide it to Steve.
If we want to view it, I mean, right now.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Bob's hooked up to the
Yeah, he's hooked up to the
okay.
live stream. sure why one monitor is out.
I think that, I wanted it for the
Wherever you can, I don't think you can see.
I think he's gonna be hooked in, but go ahead and put it there and we'll decide what to do with it.
It might be easier if he's holding it up there.
Well, he's gonna be able to put it on
On the
Bob
web.
is.
Oh.
I think.
Is this a
I
PDF?
can, yeah, I've got a PDF too, would you, and I hand you the PDF projector.
Deborah down there? Deborah down there?
Yeah, she did.
She made a call.
She did.
All right. I'm gonna have to go get that.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
I'm gonna send it to you via email. I've got my flash drive. Let me just send it to you.
I think he found it.
Did I hand it to you?
No, I'm sorry, Bob found it, and then I'm gonna give it to Steve next. Did you download that phone?
Did I download?
Did you move the file set to your computer?
I haven't yet. You want me to?
Yeah, and I can provide this on drive to Steve.
Does it need to be, Mark, does it need to be in this camera in order to be seen by the public?
They can see it from the camera here if we direct them to it, but
Okay.
he's gonna pull it up, so
Okay.
we're not gonna need that. That's why I was turning it around. You may want your commission members to see it rather than.
Sure.
They'll also have their monitors up there. Should be able to see them.
Oh, yeah, yeah. If he gets it up on the computer, it'll come up on your monitors.
And you have a JP proposal as well?
Dr. Trahan, do you have a JP proposal as well? Is that what
Yes.
he's asking? Okay.
Let me know when to put it up. I can put it up.
Please go ahead.
Is it on his? Is
It is, he's got it.
Okay. There we go.
All right, so this is the map that I'm going to propose for consideration as we continue this process. And I want to talk a little bit about it and some of the ins and the outs of this map as it relates to why it's important for us in terms of its consideration. So I want to start with what this map does. So in our original meeting, we started discussing how we planned on setting criteria. I specifically asked for clarity around what those criteria look like. And Mr. Bass had identified that Precinct 1, it was in his consultancy best interest to keep that voting age population of Hispanic voters at 55 or so percent. And in his original map, that is what he did in Precinct 1. Okay. Now, in this particular map, we have taken basically the configuration of Precinct 1 as it stands and kept it. Kept it very similar to the way it stands. The challenge with this and the whole process is that when you add population on the corridor, overall, you have to make some changes. You have to make some changes to the map because you have a higher density population on the corridor. So in a sense, there's really no way to adapt this map to the changes in population without doing some reconfiguration. In this particular map, in Precinct 1, we have kept the minority vote in Precinct 1, the Hispanic vote, to 54.69%. Now, why is that important? Number one, because it sustains the precinct as a minority opportunity precinct in the future. As we continue to grow, we're going to continue to see changes across the county. It is important for the future of Precinct 1 that it maintains that Hispanic leadership. And I agree with him. I think that's very important for Precinct 1. In addition, it includes Precinct 111 and 112 in San Marcos, which are historically Hispanic communities. And because those communities have felt represented by the commissioner in Precinct 1 for some time, we've also left those in the map. That's the reason. Now, what you'll notice here is that it looks really nice. One of the things that we want to think about in terms of mapping is the eye test, which is when you look at it, does something look fishy? Maybe it's called the C test. Does it look fishy? This map looks to the eye as clear, it's straightforward. And the reason for that is because instead of trying to take Precinct 2 and change those lines in order to include areas, both Buda and Kyle, the challenge with that is that the population centers have grown too much to include both of those areas in one precinct. Those population numbers have grown too much to include all of Buda, all of Kyle in one precinct. It just wouldn't work. The numbers wouldn't balance. It wouldn't make sense. So in this map, you'll notice that this map includes Kyle, Mountain City, and the east side of Buda, maintaining the connection between Kyle and Buda in this precinct, but also allowing for changes based on population growth. What you'll also notice in this map is that in Precinct 3, it keeps Texas State University whole. And the reason why that's important is because students oftentimes aren't clear about who their commissioner is when it's broken up into 3 precincts. And this particular map clarifies that. Keeps Texas State whole while not diminishing Hispanic vote in Precinct 1. That's a really important point too. Precinct 4 does something a little bit different. In order to adjust for population growth, as well as adjusting for the development that's happening in both Buda and Dripping Springs, this map incorporates both of those population centers into Precinct 4. Now, why does that make sense? It makes sense because, number one, remember, we couldn't include all of the population for all of Buda and all of Kyle in one precinct. That's one. Number two, it makes sense because actually, based on growing needs, development, and future growth of these 2 areas, they actually have a lot of similarities. They're both dealing with South Travis County spillover into Hays County. They both have high rates of development, so they're dealing with similar development issues. So that's the overview of this map. Okay? Now I want to talk more specifically about some of the points that we've discussed in the past, but I want to bring up some new ones. The first thing I want to bring up is that this map incorporates natural boundaries. And that's really helpful for people to know the map so they can understand where their precinct is. So here you'll notice that I-35 is a natural boundary between Precinct 3 and Precinct 1. Here between Precinct 2 and Precinct 3, we utilize the Blanca River. That's a clear natural boundary. Okay? Up here between Precinct 3 and Precinct 4, we have Ranch Road 150, Flat Creek, and Ranch Road 12, and also Storm Ranch Road. Okay? And they also line up with the voting districts. Right? So we haven't broken down census block data to try to divide this up. We've used the natural lines of the voting districts. The separation between Precinct 4 and Precinct 2, we have Jack C. Hayes and Goforth, major thoroughfares that divide these two. These are clear lines. These are clear lines that make it easy for people to see, understand, and know who their precinct commissioner is. We also did something around this that we feel really confident about in terms of communities of interest. So, in terms of communities of interest, one of the areas that we looked at is in Precinct 1 related to historical Hispanic vote and Hispanic representation. We wanted to support that representation in Precinct 1 to ensure that Hispanic representation was maintained. That is a community of interest. We also wanted to increase the potential of Commissioner in Precinct 2 working towards the developmental needs of the west side and the east side, the west side of Kyle and the east side of Buda. A lot of neighborhoods are going into this area in Precinct 2. A lot of high-density growth in terms of development. We wanted to give the opportunity for the Commissioner to focus their attention on this particular development, on the corridor. And that's what this map does. It basically incorporates a focus on that development, that high-density, high-community development, which requires wastewater attention, requires infrastructure with roads. It requires an attention to all of the development issues that come along with new neighborhoods. We also wanted to incorporate community of interest related to Precinct 4. And what we found is that there is some similarities between Buda and Dripping Springs in terms of growth, in terms of development. There's groundwater issues that are similar. We see that there is some commonality here between these communities. And in Precinct 3, we also have the hill country out by Wimberley. We have all of the land out there, rural land, and there is no way that we can keep Texas State University whole. If we move Precinct 1 in, split up Precinct 3, we are going to divide the university. And once again, we're going to divide a community of interest. So that's an overview of the reason why we made the choices on this map that we made. I also want to note that there is great transportation across these precincts. One of the things that's important is that you're able to move from one side of a precinct to another easily, both for the commissioner as well as for development and for access issues. All of these have a major thoroughfare that connects one side of the precinct to the other. Precinct 1 has I-35. Precinct 2 also utilizes I-35. Precinct 3 utilizes Ranch Road 12, moving from San Marcos out to the hill country to Wimberley. And Precinct 4 incorporates Ranch Road 967 as a thoroughfare. And this is an easier drive, in my opinion, from Dripping Springs to Buda than Ranch Road 12 is, down to Wimberley. So, we've incorporated thoroughfares. Now, last and definitely not the least important is taking a look at minority representation. This is a really important point, so please pay attention. When we take a look at Precinct 1, when we have maintained this precinct as a minority-majority representative precinct with leadership, this map also parallels the growth in the county in terms of minority representation within Precinct 2. Right now, we've had major growth on the corridor in Hispanic population, and that will continue. And
And right now, we're at a roughly equal census data overview of the county, roughly. We're even closer on the corridor. That's very equitable in terms of growth with Hispanic populations growing on the corridor. In this particular map, in Precinct 2, we have actually created the opportunity as well in Precinct 2 for minority representation. That is important for Hispanic voters, it's important for representation in the county. It is important for the corridor growth. So for all of these reasons, this map is clear, it passes the eye test, it looks straightforward, it's easy to understand, there are natural boundaries, it has good thoroughfares, it connects communities of interest, it incorporates important points on the Voting Rights Act to ensure that we have minority representation. Great map.
Can I interrupt just a minute? What is the password for the Wi-Fi in here? I'm sorry, we can't get on. Anybody share that with us?
Guest is open.
Guest is the only one? Okay, thank
Guest
you.
is open.
Yeah. Live stream.
You said your screen's not working?
I've got it on stream. Can you put it on the map again? No. I moved it off the map while you talked a little bit. It's okay, I got a picture of it. Just let me know. I move back.
There's a link.
Is there a link or anything to see it?
Is there any objection to circulating the map by email to, okay.
Or if you just share a link so we could bring it up on our own computer.
It's just, we don't have a screen over here.
Would you email just the PDF map to the commission members?
I don't have it, but I can.
You have it right now?
No, I don't have it. Well, this is it.
Oh, you mean you don't have a computer?
I don't
Okay,
have it.
I'll get a computer. I don't think there's a link to it unless Dr. Trahan has it on Dropbox or something.
That's okay.
He just pulled it out on Thumb, but I'll get it
Yeah,
to
I
you.
have a jump drive.
Oh, this isn't our
That's
GIS?
okay. It's just, because we don't have a screen, we couldn't see it up close.
Yeah.
We couldn't see
Okay,
it.
yeah, you can email
I'll
it.
circulate it to you.
He's gonna email it to me
Oh,
as well. I've got my.
You have a list of the DTDs of the election precincts.
Yeah, it's on the map, but I don't have a list that I've just.
I can pull it off for the minute.
it's M3, is that correct?
Yeah, in 3. Very technical name, Mark 3 is actually the reason behind it. So.
Well, I happen to like that. Coincidentally. Okay, so you just gonna, okay.
Got you.
There's, I can address the, as Bob was asking. Ray, if you don't mind, conversation about JP and constable maps.
Yes, sir.
And then Bob asked me this morning about the same. So just as an aside, we were going to, I'm basing some of this on what happened 10 years ago, and I'm happy to hear what you all think. And then we can go from there. What we did 10 years ago with JP and constable maps is we simply asked them about workload. There's a little bit more of the business end of the county involved on the less policy making and more simply handling caseloads and handling warrants and papers to serve and things like that when you're dealing with JPs and constables precincts. And so we simply asked them, how could we better balance workload in your opinion? And I have a request out to as many JPs as want to come to the meeting, but to a couple of the key ones that are the longer-term JPs, and then the same with the constables, to try to have that conversation with them and find out, how do we balance the workloads in your opinion better? Does anything need to change, et cetera? Based on that information, I was going to have Steve Floyd draw something up and bring it to you all to show it to you if it involved any kind of boundary movement at all. It may not, I don't know. I suspect it will, because we've had some growth over the last 10 years, and there probably will need to be some balancing. If you all have map ideas, though, that you want to beat up and deliberate about, that's fine. My concern is that with a short timeline, I don't want to distract us too much from the commissioners' precincts. I do want that still to be the primary goal. So any ideas, questions, concerns over any of that? Yeah, Shannon.
My question is, so, and I understand we've got the short timeline, but is this going to be data? Are they going to give us, we handled this many cases and this, and so we'll be able to at least look at the raw data to be able to compare those?
Yes, I can, what I received from them in terms of the justification for any change, I would provide to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you betcha.
Mark?
Now, obviously, there's a population balancing thing in play here too, so.
Yeah, Mark, can we get the law surrounding the population increase and what would dictate an additional JP? In other words, we've grown so much that it's almost time for another JP to handle the workload. And so I'd like to know what the law is surrounding the population growth and what would dictate that, instead of looking at diminishing the JP position or diminishing the boundaries to make it a one JP type situation. I don't think that's realistic for a county that's urbanizing and urbanizing quickly. So I'd like to see at least the law surrounding that.
Yeah, you bet. So, well, nothing I said should be interpreted to mean that we would be narrowing it to one.
I didn't say it did.
Okay, I know that idea has been thrown out, but I'm not promoting that necessarily.
I don't like playing politics with an issue.
Right.
And that's why I threw it out, to make it real clear.
Yeah, you bet.
That we need to look at the growth and not the anti-growth. There is no anti-growth in this county. We're growing faster than lickety-split.
Right.
And so we need to be reasonable, and we need to be really thinking about what needs to happen in the future.
Right. You might remember that the Commissioners Court entertained the elimination of one of the Precinct 1 spots while it was empty, and received some very passionate objections over that from the community, and then did not eliminate it. So I don't imagine that the court would entertain elimination of a position, particularly since they're all inhabited by people right now. The reason that one was entertained at the time was because Judge Hernandez had passed and it was an empty spot. So that didn't happen then. I suspect while there's a body in the spot, it particularly won't happen. But you're asking about the creation of an additional one. I can look into that. Yeah. Obviously, we've come to the arrangement and the physical arrangement in the county that we have through legal means, the creation of additional spots in the past. We can explore how that's done.
I brought a JP and, I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
I did bring a JP and constable map.
Yes, yeah, and if you all want to go over that, that's fine. If you all want to wait to hear from what they have to say about workload, I can bring that to you all and I think we can have plugged that in a practical way with Steve to make sure we're not getting out of balance, but trying to achieve what they think needs to be done in their collective opinion, and we can bring that to you. I don't mind either way, whatever you all want.
Yeah. As my preference, I would rather wait and do the JP and constables later. I have had some conversation with some of the judges and constables, and those conversations are still somewhat ongoing, and just need a little bit more time on that, I think.
Yeah, that's fine.
I would agree with that. I would like to add another dimension to this besides the constables and the JPs. I noticed that precinct 111 is out of precinct 1, which is where the current commissioner's county barn is at.
In this.
Yeah, I didn't see 111 in there, but
It is, it's in the map. It's just so small that you can't draw a number on it, but 111 and 112 is drawn into precinct 1. So,
okay.
thank you for asking that question, because
Yeah.
it is hard to map it with this many numbers.
I don't see 111 in here. I see 112, 114, 113, 115, 110.
111 is mapped, it should be mapped. If it wasn't mapped, it should be in.
Yeah, it's not in.
It's purposefully in precinct 1 included. So I will check that to make sure that is the case.
Would there be a way to would there be a way to give us a listing of the precincts in each of these?
Absolutely, yeah, I can give you that.
And I guess my question would be, Mark, if we take a barn out of a precinct, does the commissioner then have to build a barn in their precinct?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question?
Does a barn have to be built in the precinct if we take a barn out of the precinct?
The barns are.
Let's just say precinct 2, we take Mark's barn out of the precinct and move him completely to another district. Is he then obligated to build a barn in that precinct?
That's a question I'm not really clear to answer.
Barns are not,
I understand they're not within the count. That's not relevant. I guess I'm asking a question from a technical and legal standpoint. Do they
legally, the barn has no standing. It's not a requisite of the office. JPs have to office within their precinct. Commissioners' barns are not given legal standing, if that answers the legal question. Administratively and practically, it might be more convenient to have a barn in the precinct. Would it be required to build a new barn? No.
So I want to just make sure I understand. So did you decide that we're going to wait to see JP and constable?
As long as there's no objection, we'll wait.
So,
Yeah.
okay, I'm willing to do that. I have a map today.
What does your map do for incumbent,
Here, for this, in this map,
all incumbents are still in their district?
every single incumbent is still written into their precinct. Okay, anything else?
I might have missed something. I was having a side conversation over here. Are we can deliberate about or have questions asked and answered about Dr. Trahan's map idea. Steve, I have been told that you might have one or more of your own. We could.
I'm waiting to receive one right now. Get it
Okay.
done. And I'm just finishing up.
So what I would suggest then is until he feels his is ready to present, then maybe you all could have a conversation about what's on the table. I know you've had some, but I don't know if there are additional questions, concerns, ideas. Or we can take a 5-minute break.
I just have a quick question, Mark. Have the commissioners had a chance to look at your map? Okay.
Yeah, I think that whatever you see today, we can assume that probably not too many folks have laid eyes on it. And it is a good opportunity for me to at least remind the public. I know you all know that this is an advisory commission, so you all can bring one map, you can bring 5 to the Commissioners Court members and say, these are our ideas. Ultimately, they could even decide on their own map, that is distinct from the one that, any of the ones you all proposed. But I think they obviously created this commission because they want to hear what your collective opinion is, whether it's a consensus or whether unanimous or whether it's a divided opinion. They want to hear it. So.
My apologies. Let me clarify something. I have spoken with the Democratic commissioner and with the judge about this map, and I have given them an outline and understanding of this map.
Yeah.
I want to be straightforward about that. I have done that. I have not spoken with all of the commissioners.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough.
May I ask a question? I know you were talking about some of the transportation issues, and I think I missed, you told me, or you were talking about precinct 1 and 2, I-35 would be a great way to get around the precincts. Precinct 3 was Ranch Road 12, but I think I missed precinct 4. What was that avenue of transportation?
967.
967. And I guess my concern is I-35 is a natural boundary. Is there any concern about that? I know, having previously served on the school board, huge concerns about listing I-35 as a boundary with east and west and what the perceptions are and how that works. And I didn't know if there was any concern with that regard in using that as a boundary for this map.
Quite frankly, in terms of mapping, if you were to take that precinct 1, I guess that's what you're speaking to. If you were to take that map and you were to remap it around San Marcos to try to include San Marcos in precinct 1, it would no longer be a minority-majority voting precinct. So in terms of a boundary, I think your original question was whether or not I-35 provides some issue related to disparity. I'm guessing this is kind of what you're asking, the disparity on the east and west side of 35. And that is a natural boundary, and it has historically created a disparity, right? So are you willing to take away minority representation? Because you don't see that I-35, you don't believe it is a historically equitable boundary. My take on that is that you cannot put that precinct at risk for losing minority leadership.
I guess I don't believe that there's not an option from what, and now I'm just speaking from my experience, having schools on the east side, the west side, and really fighting that stigma of using I-35 and creating that east-west division. I just see us moving into, falling into that concern and having that happen if we use that as a natural boundary. I think there are many ways that we could look at maintaining that minority majority that would not separate it via I-35. And I say that because it continues to be a concern in the school district for Hayes. And that was something that was a conversation when I served on the board. And so that's one piece that jumps out for me as a concern.
If I can follow up on that comment, Michelle, my experience is exactly the same, that the crossover across I-35 in every aspect of community living throughout that region, I-35 is not considered by the population around there as a barrier or a boundary of any sort. The folks consider themselves people that live in Hayes County and people who are part of the Hayes County population. Their businesses expand back and forth across the highway. Their school districts expand back and forth across the highway. And although it is an obvious focus point in our county, it's not necessarily the wall of Jericho there. It's just absolutely not.
Yeah.
Trouble, Steve.
I wanted to, what do we have to do to share the screen? Share our
You
computer
have to
screen?
be hooked up to
Okay.
here,
Yeah.
unless you have like a drive, or unless you can send it to.
It'll be, yes. Generate on my computer. Where did it go?
I have no piece of passes,
Yeah.
obvious,
Okay.
so I don't know if you mind him hooking up.
How about up here? Can you-
It's over here, it's
Okay.
just a hookup over here. I think it's,
20.
I
What do
think
you
we'll
wanna
have to
do?
unhook you though if we. I
It's
don't
not
know.
projected.
You want to,
No,
you
just-
want this HD about it?
Yes, I could, please.
Yeah. I'll hook you up.
Thank you so much.
Reach.
I can make it reach in.
I'll wait till you get hooked up and then I'll, oops, I think it's on probably the other side.
You know what? My glasses on, that's my, no, it's right here.
Just a little bit.
It's right there.
Oh, it was right there.
Yeah.
Let me,
Oh, I got it, now I've got to change mine to project.
here it is. It's up there.
I did, okay. I didn't think
It's
that
up
had
there.
already said.
No, you didn't have to do anything. So it's just,
That's all right.
eh,
There we go. All right. Can everybody see that? What's that?
it's, I don't know why that screen's not working.
Well, yeah, I'll explain here. This is, actually, I didn't generate this map, so unfortunately, a third party did, and they didn't realize we were gonna show them today, so we're doing this at the last second, I apologize. This is a proposed map, obviously, for the commissioner districts. I'm colorblind, so correct me on the colors, please, okay? Bottom right corner is blue, I do believe, and that represents precinct 1. Top right is green, I do believe, that represents precinct 2. Right across the top is red, representing precinct 4. And then magenta or purple, I believe it is precinct 3. Okay? Now, one of the things that this map does, this map actually does do some census breakdowns. So it's not like Mr. Tran's map, 100% voting VTDs, voting districts. It has actually a little bit of a breakdown of some districts in order to make contiguity of the districts and to allow for certain communities of interest to be fully included. In the previous map, one of the things I noted, Texas State was moved into Precinct 3. I think it's a great idea to keep Texas State together. I think we've all agreed that the Hispanic community and the university are definitely communities of interest that we want to try to represent. But in doing so, we're also fragmenting San Marcos. And I do believe that municipalities are also supposed to be a community of interest. Because municipalities are, of course, represented by the county commissioners. And so fragmenting a municipality creates a fragmentation of representation. Currently in San Marcos is represented by 1, 3, and 4. And so it's already fragmented, and what we've tried to do is consolidate it back. So what we've done is maintain a consolidation of San Marcos, a consolidation of Texas State. We've got 111, 112, 334, 413, 414, all pulled back in. So Texas State students, Texas State housing, apartments, they're all part of the San Marcos community. They're all part of the Texas State community. They're all represented in Precinct 1. We have pulled the comments about Kyle Buda are very legit. It's very difficult to try to combine the two completely. We've made representation of Kyle a split between the two precincts, but not within the district, not within the, the municipality itself, but more the outlying areas. And we've put East I-35, a natural barrier, as part of Precinct 1, but also as part of Precinct 3. Because we don't see it as a hard boundary again, but we do see it as something we want to flow into. We want Hispanic representation east of I-35 to flow into all aspects of the county, as well as up in the north in 4, as well as in 2. And as long as we don't fragment it per se. So with this particular map, what we've done is, if you notice, Precinct 3 has encompassed a lot of the rural part of the county. We started thinking about it, and we felt like rural Hays County is also a community of interest. There are a lot of people out in Wimberley, out in Driftwood, out in the far southwest corner of the county, out by Blanco, that don't want urban folk to dictate policy to them. They want to be represented by people and represented and a part of their own set, their own class. And so we tried to create a consolidation of the rural areas into a precinct that could have a precinct representative that would make sure rural interests are represented and are protected. And then we consolidated growth corridors, which we can all obviously agree. One has got continued growth as long as we go north of San Marcos. San Marcos is pretty consolidated, but there's still going to be a lot of growth north of it and east of it. We've got that represented. Kyle Buda is obviously a dynamic growth corridor. In Dripping Springs, it's got 12,000 new rooftops planted over the next 10 years. So it's going to be a corridor. So those are going to be areas of growth, which is, you can see just by the density of population, their size, how they grow as we get into the rural area. But Wimberley, because it doesn't have the transportation corridors, it's not easy to go from Wimberley to Austin. It's not easy for a commute. And so, because there's not the transportation corridors out in the rural area, we felt like it was important to keep that rural interest protected, to make sure that if the opportunity comes up, that they have a collective voice in what goes on in their area. Because they've moved out there, they've spent money, they're voted for a reason. Oh, did my screen do that?
I touched it.
Oh, thank you. I forgot to turn on the screen saver. Thank you so much. So, so basically, this is what our breakdown is, and it all falls within 5% margin, falls under the 10% mean deviations, but it does. For instance, we take 125. It does break up a few precincts. 125, that little peninsula that comes out that created the bridge for 4 coming down. We chopped that off so that we could put them all together and not have this northwest to southeast corner island for one commissioner. We want the commissioners to be consolidated into the areas they represent, the communities of interest they represent, and be able to manage it. I agree, as was said previously, regarding JPs and constables, those are different jobs. Those need to be focused on geographic, because the JP's got to go out to the scene of a death, the JP's got to sign warrants, constables have to serve warrants. If you create too large an area, having, for instance, a constable district like this, for 3, would be ridiculous, because Andy Cable as JP or Don Montague as constable would spend an hour getting up the far northwest part of the county, or an hour down the far southeast, when we'd have other representatives within 10 minutes. So when we get into that, I think we're gonna have to juggle around and look at their geographical area of work and workload. But in this area, the county commissioners can represent a large area because they're not doing it on a daily basis of going out and meeting people, answering calls, doing things like that. They have to be able to represent a collective of people whose interests, hopefully, are united to some degree. They have to, understandably, be representative of one person, one vote. A map like this consolidates rural people together as a voice, urban people together as voices, students as voices, and works as a balance within the population. That's why we believe this is a good map. Any questions?
Yes. Sir, up here.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Masks.
I know. There's no numbers with this. There's no statistics with this. I mean, we need all the information in order to advise the commissioners.
Absolutely. I can get you
Without
that.
it,
I have it, I just don't have it presentable. I have it
yeah,
across
and I
the-
trust what you're saying,
Yeah.
but without the information behind the map, which I think at the last meeting we said, if you're gonna bring a map, bring the supporting data, which we don't have. I don't know how we can even consider this map. And while I trust what you're saying,
I appreciate that.
I trust totally what you're saying, you're very knowledgeable. You know, the fact is that we have to make decisions in regards to interacting and conversing about this map, and I just don't see how legitimately we can do that with the lack of information that we have. We don't even have precinct numbers on this map.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You're absolutely correct. Again, unfortunately, I had somebody else draw this for me because Steve Floyd gave me a great GIS map, which I've been able to work, and I've got another one that works just off BTD that we're looking at that I can show also as well. But unfortunately, the GIS map I had did not allow me to do census block segmentation on the districts because I didn't have full access to the GIS data.
Now, I have to add that putting the university in precinct 1 makes absolutely no sense to me, because then you dilute the Hispanic population, the minority population. I understand what you're saying about the rural areas. In my opinion, the last redistricting, there was a movement to make precinct 2 more of a rural area instead of an urban area. You're fighting the pattern. You're fighting the trend. We're urbanizing, and you have precinct 2 where you have major companies coming in, and you have so much construction going on. It's same with Dripping Springs and Driftwood. You have the same stuff going on there. But I don't think that being rural makes you a minority population. And I understand they need representation just like anybody else does. But I feel that a commissioner that comes from that area, which is usually the trend, they come from Wimberley or they come from Driftwood. Montague, let's just take him for an example. You know, he was sheriff of all of Hays County, and now he's constable in Wimberley because he lives out there. You know, they have adequate representation, and I don't believe that by taking them out of a district or putting them in a district, they get more representation. I just don't. Now, you look at the state rep pattern over the years, most of the state reps come out of Wimberley or Driftwood or Dripping Springs. You could give the argument that because they come out of Driftwood or Dripping Springs, they don't have the interest of San Marcos at heart. But that's not been the case. You know, Ann Cooper, who lived in San Marcos, represented San Marcos real well. So did the last one and the one we have now. You know, in my opinion. That's just my humble opinion. And so I just don't understand the logic behind, well, we need to give the rural people representation. Now, do I support that we need to give them representation? I think they have representation in Mark and Walt Smith and Lonnie. You know, I think they all have what I would call country backgrounds. Would that make sense?
Oh, Walt's definitely an actor, you can say that.
Well, there you go. There you go. So that's really all I have to say on the issue. I need the numbers, I need the statistics, I need to really look at, you know, what.
I totally respect that. As I said, I would get you that, I can get you that today. My fault, and I will accept responsibility, I did not realize we were going to come here with map proposals. I thought we were going to discuss further some of the conversation and work on maps all collectively. So the group that I've been working with did not get me everything I needed, and so that's where I'm at. I do want to clarify one point you said, and that is, I was not claiming that rural population is a minority interest, but it is a community of interest. There's a difference between the two. And I want to make sure that there's a distinction from that. As a community of interest, the interests and the needs of the rural communities are different from the urban. And I'm just, in that particular about trying to respect that aspect of the needs of representation, because the growth is not going to happen as we've seen the last 10 years, and I think we can project very safely in the next 10 years. The growth is not going to happen out in Wimberley until we get some real transportation corridors out there. Wimberley and southwest out there, it's just not going to happen until we get some transportation corridors. And so those people are going to be large lot, ranch, rural. They're going to have transportation issues that are different from urban. They're not going to need public transportation issues.
Oh, they need you at the mic, sir.
I was just hoping for this.
Yes,
As
sir.
a peaceful observer, not trying to run the meeting,
Yes,
but
sir.
I would suggest, you're so close already, if you're here, the viewing audience will hear you better.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
You bet.
I didn't even realize that. I appreciate it. Yes. So, as I was saying, the rural is not a minority, absolutely not, but they are a community of interest. Just like Texas State students are not a minority, but they are a community of interest. And so I think it's very important that as we represent Texas State students and their voice in government, we also need to represent that rural people have a different voice in government, a different interest in government and being governed than the urban people do.
I buy your argument in terms of community of interest, but we also have to follow the law. And the law specifically states what we have to do. And, it's like the county barn. Can we really take that into consideration? If legally, we're not required to. And, I understand that ethically and from a position of, hey, I got to tell you, I was raised in South Texas, and I raised chickens for FFA. Yes, chickens because it was cheaper and we were poor. But, so I'm fully familiar with the country lifestyle, and I'm fully familiar with the country concerns, and I'm all for it. But I don't know that we can consider it as part of this process in regards to, we need the numbers. We need the statistics.
Yeah, and again, I'm at fault at that for not being able to present those. Although I must admit, we couldn't see the statistics with Mr. Trahan's map simply because we didn't have the ability to see it until the very end. And so I think to an aspect from that standpoint, we all need the statistics for both maps to be able to look at them closely. The maps are being presented and the arguments are being done. I think now it's incumbent upon us as RAC members, take this information back and look at it and review it and make sure that the interests we're representing are being covered, are being protected, and make sure the law is being adhered to, because those are the criteria that we want.
And I'm Hispanic, so I fully understand the need for Hispanic representation, but my concern is if I don't have the numbers, how are the students going to dilute the Hispanic participation of the population in Precinct 1, which by law we're required to provide at least 58%? 55%?
I'm not sure the exact number. I do believe it's closer to 55 than 58. And if I remember correctly, and I'm quoting off the cuff here, so don't hold me to it, I will get you the statistics, but if I remember correctly, in our breakdown, we had a 56.1% Hispanic population in Precinct 1. And so we felt like we had a good representation collectively for Hispanic representation, for San Marcos municipal representation, for Texas State representation. And so we kind of felt like we checked off 3 boxes in one flow there. If you put Texas State into Wimberley, Texas State students in the registration there are going to add to the District 3 population and help it grow, but they're going to be far more diluted than they'll ever be in San Marcos, in Precinct 1, because they will be consolidated into, they are a much more transient, much more urbanized, they're much more interested in urban transportation corridors, they're much more interested in urban issues than the rural are, and they're not going to really have their voice represented for their future from that standpoint in their district. Whereas if you put them into an urbanized district, which is typically where all state universities are, of any major consequence in Texas, they're going to be able to have a voice in the urban area in which they are studying, living, working, residing, and voting. And so I think to a certain extent that the consolidation of Texas State in with San Marcos is a positive for their voice in the government and for their voice in issues that are going to directly reflect them, because they'll have voice on both San Marcos issues and in the county issues that encompass San Marcos.
Well, I don't understand where the conflict is now. In other words, Precinct 3 has always had the university, and I don't understand how it's not been represented within the city.
Well, the university is, if you look at 413, the average voter registration age in District 413 is 22. That's obviously students, or very much a student age population, but they're in Precinct 4. If you look at 334, it's the exact same thing. The average age is 22 for 334, but they're in Precinct 3. You've right there diluted it. 414, the average age is 27, I want to say. Very high number of apartments, et cetera. So you've got a student population there that are also in 4. So at this point in time, that student population, and those are good sized voting districts with registration, those are already fragmenting the student vote right there. And see, and there, yet all those districts are also within San Marcos municipality.
See, I kind of have to disagree with you, and I don't mean to be contentious.
Absolutely.
But I was a student here in the university, and I voted because I wanted to participate.
Sure.
So I didn't
And we want to encourage that.
I didn't feel fragmented. I didn't feel conflicted. I didn't feel like I was separate from the city or the town. Now, the police I didn't like, but they, who does as a college kid? But they never caught me. So, hey, I got away with it.
Be careful, this is being recorded.
What? Oh, yeah, I know. And I'm on record. But I've been around for a long time. I'm old now. They want to catch up with me now.
Statute of limitations probably apply.
Yeah, I'm pretty much going the other way.
Yeah.
But I just don't know, again, legally, if we have to look at that. Now, we have to look at interest, common interest. But I would say that the university being in Precinct 1 dilutes from the Hispanic population. And you want to say how? Well, they don't have any interest. They don't have a common interest, in my opinion, except for the city. Now, if you look at city council, you have a couple of students that have been elected to city council, and you have a current city council, a person running right now that is a student. So I'm not really quite sure, that it's a valid argument, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and I think you bring up a very important point that we probably need to look at, and that is, what is the breakdown of the student population of Texas State?
Right.
I mean, no offense, but it's probably changed a lot since you went there.
Well,
I mean, quite honestly, just the nature of the beast, it has grown significantly, we know that.
Yeah.
So it's probably, the dynamics in that growth have probably changed as well. There have been statements made that it is a Hispanic university, that it represents Hispanic values in Texas. I'm not saying it's true or false, I'm just saying statements have been made to that effect. And so, I think that is I think you're bringing up an excellent point, that we should sit down and get a breakdown of the population at Texas State and see, are we helping the Hispanic population? Are we hindering the Texas population, Hispanic population? And make sure that we're doing Texas State correctly. And in the same token, in voting, as you were talking about, the students, we want to encourage vote. We want them to participate in the process. We need to get them involved as early as possible and as informed as we can make them. But the simple aspect of it is, they are more interested in urban, in the localized area, like you said, San Marcos issues and the such like that, than they are in the rural area issues. And we don't want to withhold their opportunity to vote on those or vote on representatives who will reflect their interest in that area. Do we have to do this? I don't think there's anything that requires us to, but in the same token, just as we do not have to have a barn or a precinct office inside, inside a precinct, I think we all agree that public responsiveness, public interest says, I live in Precinct 3, I want to go to a Precinct 3 office in my district. I don't want to go to Precinct 2 office to do my Precinct 3 business. I think you just feel like you're getting better representation when you have somebody in your district representing you. And I think we've kind of discussed that, and I think you and I have gone on about that with 111 and moving in, et cetera, from that standpoint. And so I think it is important to a certain aspect, not necessarily by law, but by public acceptance, much like Mark talked about with the eye test. You know, the slivers and the peninsulas and things like that are obviously aesthetically kind of crazy, but in addition, it makes you question representation, fragmentation. And so maintaining more contiguous consolidated areas, districts like we are both trying to do at this point in time, I think makes better sense. But again, the students, the San Marcos population as a municipality, the Hispanic population as a whole, inside the county, all need to have their voices represented, excuse me.
Yeah. If I can chime in here just a minute, would that be all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to comment that in our research about this problem with the university, or it's not a problem, opportunity with the university, we considered a lot of different things. And one of the things that I brought to the discussion many times over was something that I heard more than once right here in this very courtroom, where our county judge expounded many times over that the university is an Hispanic university. I heard him emphatically say that, and I took heed of that. And so in our discussions, Steve, as you well know, I brought that up with great respect over and over and over again. And I know that in our discussions, we looked at the various precincts that were immediately around and in the area of the university and tried to dive into that to see what the population of those precincts were. And it just because of the age factor and some personal conversations in those precincts, we all pretty much came down to the realization that those are students of this university, which our judge rightfully calls a Hispanic university. And so that certainly was brought into our thinking, and I think you can nod in agreement on that.
I acknowledge that, absolutely.
The other thing too, when we're talking about this rural area of the county, I think we really have to give that due credence, again, that's not necessarily a minority population, but it certainly is a community of interest that deals with water issues, transportation issues, and I'm going to ask Ken Strange to chime in on that here in a minute from the emergency services aspects and things like that. That has a huge bearing on how that portion of the county is represented. I know I live in a rural part of the county, and when it comes to certain issues, if those voices are not collectively heard loud and clear, well, then they can kind of get run over by interests that are more prevalent in the high-density populations of the county. So I do think that those areas have to be considered a community of interest, certainly, because they are. And the last thing I'd like to comment on was it is my understanding that we're not here today to approve a final map. In fact, quite to the contrary, we're here to open a dialogue, a discussion, which is being made available to citizens across the county, so that therefore, when we move forward to our individual precinct area discussions on following Saturday and the following week, we will be able to have a good, open, community-located discussion as to what the concerns are from that community, and not necessarily target down to individual lines on a map. I don't think that's why we're here today. So I'd like to ask Ken Strange to talk a little bit about emergency services in rural areas, if you would, please.
Yes, definitely important that we are heard in that it is a big area and lots of transportation differences there, where ambulances are not responding 2 or 3 minutes, we're 15 minutes at some time. So it's important that we definitely look at that and keep that voice heard. So
Well, and I think also, again, as Bob mentioned too, there are various issues that have to do with transportation corridors through there because a lot of historic trails, a lot of historic families and large ranches. There are also, water issues are critical because, there's been several issues that have come up in Hayes Groundwater District and some others where outsiders have come in and tried to take advantage of water rights. And I think, it's very important for the people who live out there collectively to be able to have enough of a voice to represent the interests of the rural people and the rural areas. So I do see them as a community of interest from that standpoint. It's not that there's a great conflict, but there's greater long-term commitment to a lot of the a lot of the rural people versus some of the urban, especially, and quite frankly, among the students. The students are more transient, and they're voting on issues that in the rural areas can affect them for decades and more, and they may not even be in Texas any longer than 4 years. So I think it's a good aspect to bear in mind that communities of interest don't have to be a minority, and they can have a common interest, they can have a representative interest that's not necessarily negative or conflicting or anything, but it is centralized. And I think Texas State students want a more urban focus and have the opportunity to vote on the urban aspects that affect them, the ability for public transportation and the housing and various issues like that may or may not be included in certain issues if they're in a separate part of the county and if they're in a more rural aspect of the county. And so that's why we did that. And it's a consolidation we hope that would, again, as we looked at the map currently, it's kind of an interesting design. We were trying to consolidate. We were trying to maintain communities of interest in San Marcos, communities of interest among the Hispanic population, communities of interest among Texas State, and we threw the rural in there as a community of interest and created maps that then balanced the population and allowed for a little bit of growth corridor because we know we're going to see growth in 4 up along Dripping Springs area, and we know we're going to see growth along the I-35 corridor. And eventually it's going to have to spill into Precinct 3 and out into the rural areas, but we're going to have to talk about transportation corridors in and out of there first because people have got to be able to get into Austin for work, for whatever the case may be. Go over to Del Valley to work at Tesla if they want to. Right now, there's just no good transportation means to be able to do that from the rural part of the county. And so that's an interest that they will have, and the citizens in that area need to be able to have a good collective voice on it.
May I ask some questions?
Yes, absolutely, Mark.
Yeah, okay. So the first thing, and I'm having a hard time with this, is that my understanding of this meeting was that we were going to come in with maps that we were going to work from based on mapping at the voting district level. Is that your understanding?
I did not understand it at the voting district level because we are dealing with a census issue. So technically, the census is the real key criteria here.
So,
but I agree with you. We work both sides. I'm sorry?
It was stated in the last meeting that we come in with maps based on voting district level and then work from there. Is that, you don't remember that?
Honestly, I would have to hear a transcript. I'm not.
I asked for clarification specifically about that in the last meeting.
I'm not contradicting you. I'm just not certain I remember it exactly that way, but.
Okay, having said that, that makes me wonder about the process. We're not on the same page about the process, okay? So that concerns me. It concerns me that the expectations for today is a starting point. I'm thinking. Okay, having said that, it is very difficult for me to look at your map because I can't see the urban population centers.
Understand.
And where your map lays out on those centers. It's very concerning to me. And frankly, for our starting point, it doesn't really allow me to be able to look at your map at all with any sort of critique and understanding. So that's an issue. Just want to put that out. Second thing I want to understand is you mentioned that you wanted to use my criteria around looking at it from the eye test.
Yes.
Do you feel that your map passes the eye test?
Far better than the current map does. And I think it collectively represents, again, the communities of interest from an eye test standpoint, yes.
Okay. All right. So next question I have is around Dr. Lopez's point, around clear boundaries, right? Did you feel that your map has clear boundaries in the map that I proposed?
Here's the thing about clear boundaries. We have precincts that are divided by clear boundaries from original geographical divisions. The problem you have is that development does not respect clear boundaries. They will develop on both sides of a river. Okay? And you can have a high-density population area pop up on both sides of a river. And so clear boundaries, having done this before in 2010 and in 2000, I'm not 100% sold on clear boundaries as a necessary binder. I think you have to look at long-term projections of growth in areas. You have to look at the overall reflective communities in these areas, et cetera. So I think clear boundaries are good to try to conform to, but not necessarily adhere to.
Another question. You mentioned there was a lot of conversation, I heard a lot of conversation about rural communities of interest. Are there similar issues in Wimberley with issues of balancing natural resource with development issues?
Yes, there is.
Is there issues of that in San Marcos?
There is, but they're different.
Okay. So
They're different because...
That's similar.
Well, no, there's a big difference. Development is not the same across the board. You have commercial development, you have high-density development, you have fragmentation of ranch and historic property, and with water, you have extension of public services provided by the city. You have well water, you have groundwater issues. The issues between rural and urban are similar topically, but not in definition.
If I can also inject a little bit of extension on that, in Hayes County, because of our geographical differences in the county, it poses major differences of consideration. They call this the hill country for a reason. So, once you get out there past the city limits, all of a sudden you get into rocky up and down terrain, which you don't have in this area. So that's also a very major consideration in its mapping.
Okay. So I want to ask another question. You've made this generalization about Texas State University, and it is an HSI, which is a Hispanic serving institution. Do you know what the percentage is based on a breakdown of ethnic and racial groups at the university?
Well, I think if we could rewind today's recording, I specifically stated that's what we need to get.
Okay, great.
We need that information to be included as part of the process. And, and again, my negligence in coming to this meeting and not realizing to the level of which we needed the information was I did not have the statistics to hand to you at this point in time. And the map that was sent to me here at the last minute, I can, if I have 15 minutes, I can put you a map up with the voting precincts. This one is just a quick collective. I was trying to keep people from waiting too long. Unfortunately, it just took a little longer to get it from the final census guy, who has the software to break it down by census blocks that I did not have. I was working, Steve Floyd provided me with an excellent ArcGIS map for the VTDs, the voting precincts, which I was working from as well. And we wanted to provide two different views of how it could look at, so we could have the understanding and look at and work both from a VTD standpoint, but also look at if we're willing to go down to the census level, which is the appropriate way, considering it is a census matter. This is the other option we can look at that'll bring up even maybe greater balance and even greater representation. Because adhering strictly to VTDs, you've got, for instance, 32, which has got, 32 is a long peninsula, goes up inside to the county. Okay, the bottom half of it is in San Marcos and heavily populated. The upper part is all ranches. Okay, if we try to keep a VTD of 32, we're extending, we're concentrating a high vote down in San Marcos and injecting into a rural area, or we're injecting a whole bunch of urban people into a rural area. And so what we did is split off 32 above the high density population and put that into 3. And let 32 be down in the urban area that is more reflective of their interests and their concerns as a community of interest for San Marcos. And also 32, it's got some student population, although it's not as dense as 334, 413, or 414.
So are we clear that we're also looking at voting age population and not total population? Is that
the data I'm looking at from a standpoint is I'm looking at the total population as far as the breakdown, because it's one band, one vote, from what I understand.
Voting age population is where we are looking. Is that correct, Mr. Ballas?
We're looking at both, but voting age population is a more specific criteria for ethnic identification.
Yeah. Obviously, it's much easier to identify students when you can look at voter registration ages and stuff like that. And that's how we know 413, 414 are average registration age of 22. And when you can register from 18 to whatever, having a high density of 22 indicates there's probably a lot of young students in there. You know, and so, yeah, so we have been looking at both from a standpoint of trying to maintain a balance in representation, but ultimately, we have to have 4 districts that in population come within the 5% high and low, 10% mean deviation. And, you know, future voters, the younger age population not eligible to vote right now, 17-year-old will vote by 22.
Right.
You know, and so, you know, 16-year-olds will be voting shortly after. We can't just look at population. We do need to look also at voter registration, but population is the main criteria, since population is also what we're basing, what's the growth in these areas. Not everybody who moves into an area votes or registers to vote. We don't have 100% registration in any district. And so obviously it's very important to look at registration, but it's more important to look at population, because people will tend to stay in those areas, grow up in those areas, and then eventually vote in those areas.
Okay, so it looks like from your map, you have put, and it's hard to tell from your map.
I understand.
So I just want to be honest here.
I understand.
It's hard for me to work off of it. Buda and Dripping Springs appear to be in Precinct 4, is that correct? Is that the way your map is drawn?
The upper part of Buda towards the northern part of the county, yes. The southern part and the eastern part of Buda goes down into 1.
Okay. So
Or 2, I'm sorry, 2, not 1.
So it sounds like that you believe that makes sense. Is that true? You believe that makes sense?
Well, we're spreading some of Uland, and we're getting some of the populations that are out on the eastern corridor into representative areas, and we're trying to make sure that we have some representation in every area.
Okay. So you believe it makes sense, right? I mean, I'm getting that. Okay, and do you have a number that you're thinking of in terms of criteria for maintaining a voting age population in Precinct 1 that you feel like would establish a precedent for minority representation in that precinct as it stands based on the Voting Rights Act?
Could you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I understand.
What percentage you have in mind in terms of representation, voting age population of Hispanic voters in Precinct 1 that you want to see as criteria for maintaining?
We've not set any specific criteria as far as the Hispanic representation, other than trying to maintain the population criteria that the Census Bureau has given us as goals, that the overall purpose of the 2020 census breakdown is. We also have to bear in mind that every precinct has different registration levels and different turnout levels. Precinct 3 is a much older population, and so by and large they have a much higher percentage of the population that is registered to vote. In the same token, it's a fact that older populations tend to turn out in greater numbers in votes. They tend to, not get sidetracked by classes, by assignments, by various other things that may be the case, or life in the case of so many people with kids and sports and school and everything else that goes on. And so it's very difficult to just base it off voter registration, because again, voter registration percentages are not equal across every precinct, regardless of how you break it down. And voter turnout's not equal across every precinct. So the population, to my mind, and I may be totally off base here, but this is how we've done it best, the population is primary criteria, and the growth is a secondary criteria to keep in mind where we anticipate to see future growth.
Right.
And then we look at voter registration, and we try to make sure that we have a balance of everything that's going across the county to give everybody a representative vote.
So you agree that voting turnout is an important factor in terms of setting these population criteria, particularly for minority vote and turnout. You agree with that?
Not above population breakdown, because the county still has to be evenly divided in representation.
But it's an important factor, right?
Because a county commissioner represents a 2-year-old as equally as he represents a 21-year-old.
Sure, but you just said that voter turnout is important. I'm just trying to understand your...
No, I stated that voter turnout is not the same. I was merely trying to reflect how the differences vary across precincts between registration, between turnout, et cetera. You can't use voter registration and voter turnout as the only criteria because that swings. Depends on election. It bumped up significantly during 2018, bumped up significantly in 2020. We've seen the highest voter turnout and the highest voter registration that we've ever had in counties before because of specific elections of interest. We may not have those in the future. And it could drop way back down. And at that point in time, then what's the incentive to get people who don't normally register to vote? So those are things criteria that are so subjective to local activity, to trends happening at the time, that the most important criteria is making sure the population is properly represented so that if there is an election of interest, it's broken down properly and everybody's represented.
Okay, I'm just glad you brought this up, because I do think that voter turnout is really important. I agree that based on election year, gubernatorial versus presidential years, we have differences. We have differences in terms of geographical areas of turnout. I think all that's very important. And you mentioned voter strength, and actually the strongest voter strength currently, as the map is written, is in precinct 4. So voter strength is an important factor, and we need to keep that in mind. I think that's really important in terms of turnout and who's able to turn out to vote. And in fact, precinct 421, 236, 443, and 224 have very high rates of
Which are 2 and 4, 2 in each. 236 and 234 are both in 2, and then
currently they're in 4, that's right. Yeah, and then if your map basically in 224 would be in 2, right?
224 would be in 2, that's correct.
Okay, see, I can't tell, it's just hard to tell
Yeah.
all this because
No, and again, I'm not sure how many times I can apologize for that.
Yeah.
It was I will have that to you before we're done here. You know, as soon as I wrap up here, I'm going to get back right on it.
Okay.
And I will get you some information.
Okay.
Can you just email it to us?
Absolutely.
And Mark,
I'll send it to Mark.
just for
I'm not sure I
clarification,
have everybody's email address. Oh, you do, okay.
just for the clarification of the committee, what's the process here? I mean, we're taking maps, but they have no supporting data. You know, how can we as an advisory committee then recommend that map to the commissioner's court? Or show it or display it publicly in the public hearings? I think we need a process, and you were very clear at the last meeting that they needed to bring, and actually I think it was Lloyd. Did you not say if you could bring the census stuff with it?
Speaking to me.
Right? That was at the last.
You can't analyze a plan if you don't have the data.
And so we really need that information.
For both sides, because again, I don't have the data for the other proposal either, so we want both sides so we can look at it.
In order to recommend to the Commissioners Court, because we're an advisory committee, the maps that they should consider with the appropriate data.
Let me say that what my intention was to receive maps today, analyze those in my own database, and then make that data available to the committee and the public.
But do we put a limit on the maps? Or, I mean, we could have 100 maps and you could have 100, you could be up all night analyzing the whole situation.
If it's based on VTDs, you can put a map together pretty fast.
Yeah, it's very quick. That's what, I will have you a VTD map here in just a few minutes. I just have to update it with the latest criteria.
And would you give your name and title for the record?
I'm not sure what you mean by title, but my name is Steve Meyer, and I was appointed by Walt Smith as his representative for this Redistricting Advisory Commission.
Because there are people out there that don't know who you are.
I understand, yes.
And we're going to need, I guess, if you've broken down the census block data in your map,
Yeah,
we're going to need all of that. We're going to need block assignment files so that we can take a look at the data.
And I already have that data. I just don't have it in a presentable form. Like I said, I have it as CSVs. Michelle, I think you've had your hand up there for a while.
Yes, so is there a possibility for us to break for 15, 20 minutes to have a recess to allow time for that data to be then given to everyone on the commission? Maybe even a 30-minute so that if you wanted to review it, look at it, and then come back and determine what it is we would like to at least have available for Bob to work for us and be able to, I know we have a meeting also scheduled for Wednesday to prepare for the Saturday meetings, but would that be something amenable then for us to consider?
I would agree that I think we need to take a break so we can get the data, because it's just talking kind of out loud.
And I'd just love to get some water. Dry throat thing. So, yeah, if we could all agree to take a 15.
I think
to 30
that'll be
minute
fine with us. Sure.
break. Mark?
Yeah, I'm great with that.
When do you want to announce it? Just say we're taking a 15.
We're gonna take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back after that.
Okay, everything's on. Who wants to?
Could I start off with a general question of Mr. Bass? In the map that you originally provided to the commission, you placed an emphasis on the 55% Hispanic Opportunity District. Can you tell me what is the importance of that, or are there some legal reasons behind that?
Under the Voting Rights Act, we're compelled to honor, or at least preserve and protect established minority voting patterns. We should not dilute or fragment identifiable minority communities of interest. The Precinct 1 has been a successful majority district for many years, and so keeping it as viable would be a concern, and I deem it a necessary part of any successful plan. When I got the data for Hayes County, Precinct 1 was the first place I looked to analyze kind of where it was, and it came in numerically balanced, but very perilous as a minority-majority district, in that it was down to about 50% of voting age population, and that's not really a viable percentage. A minimum would be somewhere about 55 and up. The historical success of a minority candidate to be elected from that district indicates that there is a cohesive voting block of Hispanic voters in that precinct, but it's not to say that that would continue. And so one of my focuses was to try to strengthen it somewhat. And I think 55% is sort of a bottom of the ladder. It could be stronger perhaps, but certainly it needs to be at about 55 or greater to retain its viability.
Thank you.
Now, those are just rules of thumb. There's no hard, fast, written rule as such, but it's just over the years that's kind of...
I'm assuming you're talking about the case law has indicated that that's preferable. So you also seem to indicate the voting age population was an important metric. Why is that, and what is the law on that we need to follow as opposed to general population?
Voting age population is a better indicator of the viability on election day of a particular precinct in terms of minority voting rights. Minority populations tend to be demographically younger than a similarly sized group of Anglo voters, for example. And so if there are fewer minority voters due to age, 18 or above, then that means you need more of those voting age eligible voters in that district to be viable. Also, traditionally, historically, to date, Anglo populations turn out to vote at higher rates than minority voters do, although the black population is gaining ground and is now voting at about the same percentage in a typical community. It's not always the case, but the black population has learned that their power at the ballot box is valuable, and so they turn out and vote. I don't know that the Hispanic vote yet understands how powerful their vote is, and have yet to turn out at equal levels to similarly sized Anglo population. So that's why we use voting age population as sort of our baseline in determining the viability of districts.
So as we, kind of back to Michelle's question earlier, as we try to establish some of the ground rules on this, we should be looking at both the voting age population rather than necessarily general population to comply with the Voting Rights Act, as well as keeping in mind the Hispanic Voter Opportunity District that we have in Precinct 1.
You use the total population for numerical balance analysis.
Right.
But you use the voting age population for viability of that district as a political question. Is that district, I've seen districts that have what appears to be a viable number of total population, and it varies within county to county, but it could drop several percentage points off the total population to where it's not a viable political district. So the voting age population is what we look to determine potential viability of a district.
Thank you.
Can I borrow your issue line?
Say again?
Can I borrow the issue line?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Steve, before you get started, I'd just like to make a couple general comments here, kind of addressing just the overall theme of the work that we're doing here, and just remind everybody that we are one RAC commission. We're not a divided body. We're working together for the benefit of all the citizens in the county as a commission and as an advisory board to our county commissioners. So I think from my own perspective, that's very, very important for my team, so to speak, to recognize. But I consider this body really as an entire team. I don't really consider it divided. The other thing that has repeatedly come to mind as we've been working around and doing our interviewing, and the case becomes fuzzy and more fuzzy all the time, and that is what is an Hispanic community of interest? What does that mean? In today's voting and economic criteria here in Hays County, what is a Hispanic community of interest? Dr. Trahan, you spoke to that quite a bit earlier, and what is that definition?
Well, what I just heard from Mr. Bass is that we're looking at minority representation as it relates to the percentage of minority voters, voting age population in a precinct. So
but what does that mean? What does that mean, a minority voter? I mean, if you had to list 1, 2, 3, what's a minority voter? What is a minority voter? I mean, just because somebody's name is Garcia, does that make them a minority voter? What does that mean in terms of San Marcos and Hays County? And so what does it mean?
You look at cultural interests. So you may not be interested in a quinceañera, but people with Hispanic heritage might. I mean, they would have that in common. They might not be interested in the ranching issues that you perhaps deal with in your area. And we talked about that as a community of interest. But I think there's some cultural and heritage backgrounds that certain people have that are historic and expressed in a variety of ways as communities of interest, where they gather, where they go to church, what celebrations they have, that sort of thing. I think that's kind of a standard, if I'm not correct. Dr. Trahan?
Yeah, and there's also this issue, historical issue, of attempts to reduce representation in groups of people that identify in a minority population. And so what we're tuning into is the Voting Rights Act, which actually sets a legal precedent around that. And so while you've kind of phrased this in terms of a community of interest, which there is, and Shannon spoke to that, but there's also an issue related to the law and to the precedent of supporting minority representation in precincts. And so, I mean, I think that you're suggesting that there's a broader definition of communities of interest. Sure, I mean, communities of interest are important. We've all been talking about that. But this is actually a legal issue related to representation. that we're talking about here. This isn't an issue just related to communities of interest.
Well, I think along with that discussion, it's really careful that we not step in the pile, so to speak, when we're talking about a legal definition here, because to me, just because some person might, for example, go to Catholic church and might celebrate Cinco de Mayo or other things like that, really doesn't equate at all to what their voting aspirations might be, or their career aspirations might be, or their family aspirations might be. So I just think it's important, that we maybe broaden our focus a little bit and realize that all of the voters in Hays County all live under one flag and have the same opportunities and aspirations under the Voting Rights Act that any other voter does, and not in our thinking necessarily isolate them just because they favor certain cultural aspects within their own household, because there is a broader picture.
Well, we're talking here about census data.
Absolutely.
Right. So we're not talking about whether they attend Catholic church. We're talking about self-identifying with a particular group. So I mean, there's a designation there. That's not just a, we tend to engage in cultural activities. This is more of this is a state of demographic that we utilize for understanding trends. So it's different than just saying if we look at everybody as being one, then basically the argument that Steve suggested that rural voters might have different interests than urban voters, you've just discounted that argument. In a way.
No.
Because you're saying we're all kind of the same in the same boat. And so what I want to suggest here is that we are trying to discern what is the nature of the legal requirement that we're under related to understanding the diminished potential of representation of minority voters. And then we're also taking a look at these communities of interest, but we're not required by law to look at that. We look at that as the benefit to the community. That's part of the way that we kind of formulate our thoughts around this. So it is.
I don't think we have any disagreement about the law. I really don't.
Okay.
I don't. I just, as we move forward in our discussions, as we move forward in our community discussions over the next week or so to come, I am personally going to be keenly aware of listening to the citizens for what their aspirations are for their livelihoods and their family, and how any kind of geographical lines that we draw here and recommend to Commissioners Court might be impacted by those thoughts. So I'll do that. And I'd like to hear from Steve Meyer a little further about your data, if we could.
Okay, Mark, in,
There you go.
the podium here. Okay, this is a map that is VTD based, as we talked about, since you brought that up, and as our last discussion. So we have presented up here a proposal that is VTD based. You can see the numbers on the side. I've actually even included some of the breakdowns of the numbers, and you see on the numbers on the side, the first column is the County Commissioners District.
Before you start, Steve,
Yes.
is there any way to send that this way, or I guess maybe I could sit up at one of the screens, possibly? Thank you.
I'd say I'm over this way for you.
Here, you can sit right here. I'll move down there. I'm good.
It's fine, just so that I can see.
Now, first thing I want to mention is, as I talked about earlier, the previous map, if you notice, did not have the bootleg going in, 332, that long peninsula. Everything north of San Marcos there is largely rural. There are less than 100 voters in that entire long block that injects into Precinct 3. Same thing, 225. Once you take 225, basically past Mountain City and outside from behind the high school and the middle school, everything out there is again rural or ranches and very, very low population. And that's one of the reasons we did the census plot, because chopping those off and putting them into the other districts made better visual, as you pointed out, Mark, better visual sense, and it did not dramatically affect the impact and breakdown of populations. But as I was saying, anyhow, the first column is the commissioner district, second one is the number of precincts in the district, the third one is the population for those districts. The fourth one is how many registered voters, and this is as of October 10th registration data. How many registered voters are there? What is the mean age of the registered voters? And then you have female, male, and undeclared breakdowns. How many voted in the 2020 general election? How many have never voted? Thank you, I'm sorry. How many have never voted? And how many are new registered voters? So I think it gives a good, you wanted data, you wanted to understand the breakdown and the look of the counties. And I think this gives a good reflective comparison of the counties with data as we're proposing from that standpoint. And you can see, you see the fluctuations in the registered voters versus total population. And it conforms to the average age. Younger areas are going to have more kids. Older areas are probably not going to have a higher registration value just simply because there are more people who are of registration age. And so that's all basically reflected in there. But as you can see how that is the proposal that is just VTT based on how the county could look, that would represent the rural interests. As you see, we're going up into the northwestern Hayes County with 3 because the vast majority of that west of 12 is still undeveloped, although there's a lot of houses platted right along 12 right now. 4 comes in and goes over to the other side, to the northeastern part of the county, incorporates northern part of Buda and the rural areas to the east there. Kyle is fully encompassed, and east side of I-35 there, and then San Marcos with Texas State and the San Marcos city limits are encompassed in one.
Steve, I think it's also fair to say that this map, as we know it, does not displace any county commissioners or county commissioner
Does
offices.
not displace any county commissioners, does not displace any precinct offices, everything is intact, everybody is intact.
Or constables or JPs at this point. Yeah.
Well, this actually is just the county commissioners, we're not looking
I
at
understand
JPs,
that,
we haven't got
but
to
that was
yet.
part of that, thank you.
But it would keep all the seats in the same house, so the constables and JPs should be protected without any problem.
I'm particularly interested in maybe some extended comment on that area down in Precinct 1 in and around the university. And the reason I ask that is I'm going to come back to the repeated comments I've heard from our county judge in here about, and also our other members of the committee, and that this university area is an Hispanic university. There also tends to be Hispanic cultural center type thinking and activity there. It makes it pretty much contiguous with San Marcos, so there's no line, so to speak, throughout that region with this map.
The vast majority of
And
Texas State is encompassed in San Marcos.
I just can't imagine that any kind of division within this region would be a good way of thinking that we're maintaining a community of interest throughout that area.
Would you mind, I'm sorry, Steve, would you mind scrolling out just a little bit?
Sure, yeah, I just wanted to bring in while Bob was talking about that. But
Let's do forward.
one more level there.
Yeah. If I also make comment, just one further comment there in terms of growth patterns in the county and the unspoken communities of interests within those neighborhoods where you have similar neighborhoods, similar school districts, kids going to, common schools and moving up through the ladder. business, immediate neighborhood business communities and so forth. I think this map here pretty much keeps that together across the county as communities of interest would be defined.
Well, you know, an interesting aspect of it, which is tangential at best, but the simple fact is it consolidates San Marcos much more so in conformity with the city council and with school boards. And, you know, and whereas before we had, as I said, you know, we had San Marcos represented by 1, by 3, and by 4, fragmenting all those areas out. This is maintaining, or trying to maintain, specific communities of interest and people with common interests, common goals, neighbors, neighborhoods. Yes, ma'am.
And it's probably just the level of magnification on here, but it looks like 418 is part of Precinct 1 and then part of 417. I mean, it looks like it's an island.
Check and make sure.
And then there's no numbers for 418.
Yeah, so 418 is basically a sliver. It runs up I-35. I mean 416, my apologies.
416, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And 416 runs out 35. And then also,
Believe it or not, that's all a corridor that connects 416 from down here to up here.
Can you explain what the necessity was for that?
Well, that's just, again, we're going on VTDs. That is the entire voting district. It runs up I-35. I mean, obviously, nobody lives in the middle of I-35, but it is a connector to the upper part of it. And so if we're maintaining, as was discussed earlier, I get back to the podium, so if we're maintaining, as was discussed earlier, the voter districts, then 416 has to be included upper and lower like that. And makes it look strange, makes it look like there's an island, but there's green all along I-35 that connects them.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Steve, would you scroll out again?
Sure, no problem.
What I'm looking at is where your population numbers are in terms of your ballots, because the way that I've got this, I'm looking at this, it's not balanced by precinct population.
It runs from 4.3 to 3.7 plus and minus, so a total of 8 deviation.
8%?
8% total. Between the two. 4.3 on the high, 3.7 on the low.
I'm getting that. We have a discrepancy in precinct 4, 5,158 to the norm, to our number. Is that within our deviation?
It's 5,000. No, the deviation is, we have 240,000.
Right.
Okay, so it's 60,000. So you're using the wrong number.
No, I'm not, actually,
It's 57.6 from 60,000 is only 2,400.
maybe I don't have this map right. I'm trying to make sure I do, because I don't, oh, I see, maybe there's an issue here on that. Let me just make sure I'm clear.
So is something that we can consider as the rack, the splitting of some of these, because you had made the point about 332, doesn't make a lot of sense because it's this long string up and it's got different populations, different communities of interest. Is that under our authority in this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as long as they're contiguous, the precincts are contiguous.
Right. But
We have the ability to create, we can create another map that goes from northwest to southeast.
Okay.
And I mean, you know, but that's not necessarily what we want to do. And, you know, and yes, 332 and 125 are, again, the main differences on this map versus the other map, because then we took the census block and moved those less populated areas over into other districts so that it looked aesthetically better.
Right. Well, 416 is not aesthetic.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but it looked aesthetically better from that standpoint, made more sense as a map because things were, you know, more collected, more compact. From that standpoint, you didn't have these little fingers pointing out, so to speak. And so that's why we did it with 332 and 125 from that particular standpoint. But as far as the actual vote change and everything that goes between those two in doing that shift, it's negligible.
Okay.
What is the minority breakdown? Do you have that?
I don't have that. This is actually, you know, my understanding is when we came up with this, then that's when we give it to Bob, then he will look at the map, based on the blocks we're giving and everything, and be able to give us the minority breakdowns and be able to certify that we're doing the right thing. All I was looking at was coming up with an aesthetically, community of interest protected, block-oriented map that met the population requirements. And then subjecting that to review, further review for making sure we meet everything else. Because that's one of those things then, you know, my data, your data, it's his data that matters. Because he's the consultant who's been hired.
Can you give that printout to me?
I can generate a printout for you. I can get you a hard copy of that, absolutely.
Or send it, email to me?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can give you a summary that just has the precincts as well as detail.
So you realize this map does split Dripping Springs.
Yes, well, yes, it does. It splits the downtown Dripping Springs, and again, that's one of those areas. If we go VTD, it creates, you know, in certain aspects, your map versus my map, et cetera, is going to create some discrepancies from that standpoint, but yes, it does. And you'll also notice if you're looking at any numbers in there, for instance, 320 and 333, 320 doesn't have any population counts or anything, and that's because 333 was split into two precincts, 320 and 333, but the election board has not divided the data or has not categorized the data yet because they're not official, they haven't been voted on. And same thing with 449, it's been split into 449 and 450. And so they're included on the map, but all the data that was used to tabulate them was based on 449 because 450 and 320 was based on 333 because 320, those two don't exist yet, technically, but they are mapped on the new map going forward.
Okay, so this was my observation earlier, that looking at voting age population of Precinct 1, it drops to 39.8%. Precinct 1.
Yes, sir. Precinct 1, I mean, if you look at the population breakdown of Precinct 1 versus 3 and 4, you find much more starter home, or many more starter homes, you find students, you find, by nature, Precinct 1 is going to be younger. There's nothing we can do to avoid that. It's a question of, are we allowing that younger voice to have a collective voice?
How does that support the Voting Rights Act?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the Voting Rights Act is representation of minority groups in the process of looking at voting trends, making sure.
Right.
And what this has done is watered down representation of that particular racial identity group in Precinct 1.
How does age and racial identity correlate?
I'm just telling you what the percentage voting age population is now in Precinct 1. It's 39.8%.
Understand, but then you went on to say Voting Rights Act, you went on to quote about minority aspects, and I'm not understanding the correlation, that's what I'm saying.
Well, what I'm suggesting to you is that, my understanding is that in terms of maintaining Precinct 1 as a minority as a minority majority represented precinct, we were shooting for 55%, which was an increase, and you took it down to 39.8, which was a decrease. So I'm unclear as to how
39.8 what?
percent Hispanic vote within Precinct 1.
They don't have the precinct, they don't have Hispanic. He doesn't have that information.
I did not base this on, the census again. This is where I was talking about doing the review with Bob.
Hispanic.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I'm just utilizing census data here to give you some feedback that what this map does is it turns Precinct 1 into a white majority precinct. 41.8% voting age population, 39.8% Hispanic, and 8.8% Black African American.
I guess we don't, Dr. Trahan, something that I'd written down from what Mr. Bass said earlier, that minority populations tend to be younger when they vote, is what I understood he said, and that this would reflect that, but we don't have any ethnicities in here. It was just purely the population and looking at the voting age.
Okay.
So I think until we get that piece from Bob, it might not be as easy to see that. But for me, looking at it at 37 as the trending age, it does seem to fit with what Mr. Bass was saying, that if we had minority populations that were there in aggregate in larger numbers, that they tend to be younger when they vote. And so looking at 37, to me, it seems that that kind of fits what he was telling us earlier. Because he was sharing, when we were talking about the Voting Rights Act and looking at the Hispanic population of 55%, then he was sharing that then minority populations tend to be younger. And so that's what I had written down here from that conversation a little while ago. And then looking at the average age there, it's 37. So it is definitely younger from the other three precincts when you look at those ages. So it seems to fit what he was saying, looking at these numbers.
That's not how I read the Voting Rights Act, though. It's not about your age, it's talking about the identity.
What I'm saying is that it's just, yes, 55%. We can't even say anything about those percentages right now because we don't have that data on this map. But looking at what he was saying about the trend in age, then it does seem to fit that that might be the case still.
Yeah.
So that's the only reason why.
Well, I also want to respond to that because I think that's an important point. What is voter strength? So the question, I guess, is whether we believe that students are more likely to turn out for elections than other groups,
Depends on the issue, I think.
right?
And don't we have that data? We show what the percent or the numbers for the 2020 general election and then the number voted with this?
We could look at a couple of respective precincts from that standpoint.
So what you're suggesting is that lower aged voters that identify as Hispanic, Latino, Mexican, Mexican American, the voter strength, you're suggesting that they are more likely to turn out in an election if you include areas that have a younger population. And so you're incorporating age into your concept of why it would be okay to drop the percentage of Hispanic voters in a precinct.
I haven't said anything about percentages of minority populations because we don't have that data. And there's nothing that we have put on this map that shows here's the percentage breakdown for each of those. All I'm saying is that when Bob spoke, Mr. Bass spoke, he did say that tended to be, when we were talking about the Voting Rights Act, that the minority populations tend to be younger voters. They tend to be younger. And so all I'm saying is that when we look at this map and you look at the voting age, the average voting age, it is the youngest average voting age out of the other three precincts. And so until that, it seems to fit a bit of what he was saying, but we don't have the populations and the percentages to be able to meet that out and say, yes, this is correct, this is right, this looks there. And I think Steve's going to show, if he can, what that looks like in maybe a couple of those precincts, those voting districts.
So Texas State University is 39% Hispanic. About. It's close, that's close.
Texas State, right?
39%. That's what makes it a Hispanic serving institution, right? But it's not a majority Hispanic institution. It's 39%, right?
Yes.
So when we're talking about these numbers and we're generalizing that there's Hispanic voters and they're young, that's a generalization because, frankly, there's probably somewhere around 55%, I don't know the exact amount, 55% of white voters at Texas State University that are students. So generalizing that you are taking those voters, that the voting age is lower, and therefore there's more potential for Hispanic voters that are young to show up in those precincts, there is an issue related to voter strength, but we also can't generalize all of the students as having that potential because they're young. And I just think that's I think that's a little bit of a generalization, but.
And that's not the generalization I have made.
Okay.
I'm having a technical issue here, and I'm not sure how to fix it.
While you're doing your technical issue, I'd like to ask a question. You know, I was told that somebody came before Commissioner's Court and said Precinct 1 was perfect, that it was good, that there was no problems, that we needed to enhance it, but I don't understand why we continue to change the very basic core fiber of Precinct 1. Now, you brought up, I'm not sure where you were going with the Hispanic issue, that you didn't want it to be seen as, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where you were going with it. But I can tell you from an individual who's lived in this community most of his adult life, that there is a cultural being here, that Box 112 is the center of that. And you know, I remember when I first got here, I heard stories of the Cuauhtemoc Hall and the elders, Hispanic elders meeting there. And that's where all the Hispanic young people came. And there were decisions made as to who was going to marry who was going to take care of what, if there was a problem, how it was going to get resolved. So I think the Hispanic issue is an incredibly important issue. There would not have been a Voting Rights Act if it wasn't. I remember going to Greenville, Texas, when I was working for the state, and they refused to serve me lunch or even take my menu item. Why? Because I was brown. I was Hispanic. So you ask, how does a Hispanic identify as a Hispanic? His last name gives it away. Judge Becerra, I'm sure, identifies as a Hispanic. It is very crystal clear as to how people identify as Hispanics. But I don't understand why we start with Precinct 1 and decide that we can do whatever we want with Precinct 1. Put the university in, put rural people in, put all these other people. And I know we're looking at the numbers, and I know it makes sense from the number standpoint and the census standpoint. But you really have to look at common interest and the interest of those neighborhoods. And I just don't see how 418, which while you can make the argument there are Hispanics in there, but the university, 332, 340, well, it's disappeared now.
Sorry.
It's all right. I was using your map.
Yeah, I was getting ready to do something. Okay. There it is.
334, 317, and 415, and 332 have anything in common with Precinct 112, 111, and the east side of basically Kyle and San Marcos. So, I don't know. I don't like this map. I'm just going to be very honest with you. I don't like it for a variety of reasons. I just don't like it. That's all I have to say.
I've zoomed in a little bit.
That's it. That's all I have to say.
No, that's great. I appreciate you doing that. I zoomed in, and you were asking about 332 and 334. If you notice the core of where Texas State University is, it's the surrounding area where there's a lot of student housing, student apartments, et cetera. And so, again, we were trying to protect the community of interest of Texas State students. And so we were including those areas around the university where the students tend to be and tend to congregate.
Listen, my main objective when I was going to the University of Texas State, where was I going to party that night? Now, let me ask you this. How does that have anything to do with somebody, an 90-year-old, I can even go 90 years old, lady who lives in Victory Gardens, who is tied culturally to her community? It just doesn't. It has nothing to do one with the other.
Agree with you.
And the 90-year-old is Ramona Rodriguez, by the way.
Which community is she tied to, if I may ask?
The Hispanic community.
Okay, and where is the Hispanic community in relation to where she's located?
Right in dead center where she's at.
Which is, what precinct?
Victory Gardens, 112.
112, and 112 is consolidated in there as opposed to?
But what does she have in common with a student? You're looking at interest, common interest. What is the common interest?
Well, but if you look at the overall population of 112, it tends to go much more towards the younger than the older. I recognize a 90-year-old lady's interest is going to be far different from an 18-year-old.
Well, I'm going to use your argument about rural versus urban.
I understand. But what I'm also saying is we have to look at the majority of interests in an area, because how many 90-year-olds, honestly, how many 90-year-olds are there in that precinct?
Unfortunately, quite a few now.
That's incredible. Well, that's not unfortunate. That's a great thing that people are living that long. That's a wonderful thing.
And I'd also like to say that Texas State doesn't really relate to Precinct 3 either, because Precinct 3 is mostly rural, unincorporated. They depend on the county to take care of all their infrastructure, what little bit of infrastructure there is, and Texas State's completely different than Precinct 3.
Ken, I would disagree in terms of Precinct 1 has a variety. It has college kids, it has everything. Precinct 3 is the same way. You got Willow Creek in there, you have Wimberley in there, you've got all kinds of people in there. You have the Baptist Academy in there. You know, so it is just a different variety. The college kids have more in common with the Baptist Academy and with the Willow Creek people, in my opinion, than they do with a 90-year-old sitting in the middle of San Marcos, Texas, who all she cares about is whether she's getting off of dialysis at a certain point so she can eat.
But in the same token, let's look at other issues. Let's take away.
But I'm using your very argument.
I understand, and I'm doing the same thing. Let's look at other issues. Let's separate students and age. And let's talk about just common needs. And let's say, who needs bus service more, rural or urban? Who's more interested in the infrastructure for public transportation, for public access to services, etc.? Out in the rural areas, people have vehicles, they're used to driving trucks, they're separated by distances, you couldn't put a good bus route out there. So the interest in those aspects can be vastly different. It would be like having Western Travis County, the vote in Western Travis County versus UT.
I would propose the same argument you just made, that a 90-year-old has nothing in common with a 20-year-old. Nothing whatsoever. And I don't accept the premise that the needs of the rural and the needs of the urban are not the same. They need medical care, they need transportation, they need everything that the urbans need.
The vast majority of the time when people move to a rural area, they are self-sufficient. They have to be, just because of the rural location, because of the distance from services, because of the distance from convenience. So by and large, people who choose to move into a rural area are making a conscious choice of self-sufficiency. And so they're less dependent upon metropolitan, municipal, urban type services, and they're more interested in what the county's doing for them. The county's keeping up their road, the county's clearing the right of way, the county's doing things like that, issues that you don't have necessarily in the urban area. There is a big difference between rural and urban, interests in service from the county standpoint, and needs from the public service and public community standpoint. But I would say the 90-year-old probably wants bus service too. The 90-year-old probably doesn't drive that much. And so she may need bus service, she may be able to get transportation through other means, but I know a lot, or I shouldn't say a lot, I know a few elderly people who ride the bus in urban areas. Because they don't want to have a car, they don't feel safe driving their car, or their kids have taken their keys.
I'm going to go back to Ken's argument. That rural person wants that ambulance in 5 minutes, not 10, 15, or 20. They could be dead by then. The urban person wants the same damn thing. They want that ambulance in 5 minutes. I know, I've been in the hospital 9 times this year.
But the difference is, as I move rural, I understand that it's going to take longer for an ambulance to get there. I know that. I move to a rural
I
area.
understand that, but you still want that ambulance.
Especially if they live on a gated farm.
Well, yeah, it's never fast enough, I can assure you of that.
Absolutely. Neither a fire department either, or a police officer.
And if we want to get down to the rudimentary level, we all need oxygen to breathe, we all need water to drink. I mean, we're always going to have things in common, urban, rural, whatever you talk about, we're humans.
Sure.
And there are going to be specific needs. But we also have, as community of interest, larger things that are specific to government services that are more focused one way or another.
What I'm trying to express to you is that you cannot express a rural argument and an urban argument and then, detract it from a university and a senior living in a Hispanic area. It's the same thing. It's the same argument. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not trying to be in conflict with you. I'm just saying that you cannot change The argument is the same.
The whole reason we have this rack is so that we can all talk about this and we can bring these issues to forefront and make sure everything is represented. I don't take it as an argument or a personal argument, I take it as a discussion of the issues. And so it's important. In the same token, in that 90-year-old, if she's in a rural county, then rural county resources may be allocated to her, which are going to take longer to get to than urban maybe. There's a lot of arguments could be made both ways. I'm not sure there's a finite answer when you have to admit that the 90-year-old is the exception to a district when the average age is below 30.
In my opinion, though, it does not.
It has to.
It does not.
It
does not give you the ability, in my opinion, to just say, forget it.
No, it's not
Let's forget the Hispanic issue. Let's forget the senior issue.
No,
Let's forget.
It's never forget it, but it has to be an accommodation appropriate to the most served.
That's the art of politics, is compromise. And what I'm trying to get to you, or get across to you, is that we have to look at common interest. And there is no common interest between a 90-year-old and a 20-year-old. There just isn't. And
So should one person dictate what is common interest or what is defined for a district?
Well, obviously, it's each and every one's particular or personal, opinion.
I think Michelle had something.
I know she did.
Too.
Yeah, I definitely can appreciate the differences between a 20 and a 90-year-old. But I think back to about 13, 14 years ago, in San Marcos, the university had a contentious relationship with the city leaders. We were constantly dealing with noise in neighborhoods. We were constantly looking at how do we stop the partying in neighborhoods. And eventually, the city leaders and the university said, let's work together. And that's where Achieving Community Together, the ACT campaign, came out. And it was really looking at, from this perspective, in San Marcos, yes, our students that are at the university are here for a short amount of time, but they're part of the community. They also have responsibilities to be good, engaged, contributing citizens. But our community, too, it was coming from that aspect of we, as a community, need to embrace that these students are coming in, what they're bringing. They're bringing additional economic stability. Because of the university, we have additional individuals who are living in our communities as professors and as administrators. And so at some point about 13, 14 years ago, we started seeing that, yes, we can see all of this together as a community, particularly when it came to the city of San Marcos. And so I guess I pushed back a bit because that conversation has been happening citywide for over a decade now, that we have to come to some agreement that all of these interests are important and that we're going to have a large majority of the students that are here and how can they be a part of this community, as well as the long-term residents who've been here. And I don't know if we pull the extremes that gets us to where we need to be in getting to some sense of common ground for this.
Michelle, I accept your argument. I think it's a good argument because I lived through most of that. But I need you to understand that I was a student here at one point. And I was also the first Hispanic school board president of San Marcos, Texas. So, to tell me that the university and a culturally Hispanic area has something in common that's not even close to age just doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make logical sense to me. Now, I understand the whole aspect of working together and trying to get it all done together, and we have. We've learned to live with the university. I've learned to live with the university. I've learned to metamorphose into an old person, here in San Marcos, Texas.
Experienced.
I'm sorry?
Experienced person.
Wiser.
Experienced, very experienced. And I will tell you, it's been a process. But I cannot feasibly, in my own mind, I don't want to say attack or whatever, but go into a Hispanic area and put it in with a college area. It just doesn't make sense to me. And we're talking about common interest. And I still haven't had an answer to the first part of my question, where I said somebody stood in this commissioner's court and said Precinct 1 was fine, that there was not a problem with it. Who did that? Because I heard about it several times. But yet, we continue to go after Precinct 1. And I don't understand why we're doing that. Can anybody explain that to me?
If I may, under the Voting Rights Act, we have certain things, places we can go, and certain places we can't. We don't have the numbers yet off of your program, so we can just chat here for another couple of hours, and we're not going to solve anything.
Exactly.
We need to know, because we have to work off of the census data, and we don't have that at our fingertips. So I think.
We need to exchange data on both sides, so that we
Right.
can both look at it, and obviously, there's going to need to be some discussion and compromise, because I think we're both trying to go for the same thing. I think we're coming about it from two different approaches, and obviously, if we're wanting to meet in the middle, then that's a great place to try to navigate towards. Yes, go ahead.
Ruben, I think I can address this thing you've heard. I believe Bob Bass stated that Precinct 1 was almost perfect during his presentation. He's referencing the one person, one vote rule, which is the balancing of populations in the precinct. But then, as you heard during Bob's presentation of his map, he thought that bolstering the voting age minority population in Precinct 1 a bit more was a good idea. You can debate that topic. But I think what you're hearing is one facet, one consideration was given, and that is the population and the deviation of the population between the precincts to try to balance them. That does not necessarily accommodate the Voting Rights Act and what you might try to address with that. So you sort of look at this thing from different angles. And when you look at it from one angle, it may look right, and then you look at it from another angle, and then it doesn't. The idea, I think, and what you all are trying to accomplish is to try to figure out how it looks best from all angles.
Mark?
Which is why you can have differences over it, so.
If Precinct 1 was 52% before we started, and you want to get it to 55%, you don't have to put in half the rest of the county to do it. And, I don't understand why you can't add additional minority populations, even if it's in the center of Kyle. Why you have to go all the way to the university or to Dripping Springs or wherever you're going with those other precincts in there, I just don't understand why you have to do that. And it seems to me that diluting Precinct 1 is really going to be the outcome of all of this and the loss of a minority district. And I don't want to see that. I'm going to tell you that right off the bat. Now, it's lunchtime, and us old people like to eat. So I'm going to shut up, and we can go on. Sorry.
Well, along those lines, Bob, you may notice, has disappeared. He was having computer problems, had to run back to Austin to fetch another laptop before he makes his trip to Bastrop to do the same thing for them today. So we've lost him, but he asked that if Steve, the Steves, could provide him with a copy of that map. I believe he has Dr. Trahan's proposed map in his computer as long as the laptop survives. If not, I'll provide it to him again. He's going to work on crunching those numbers and verifying those numbers. I think you all had numbers associated with yours, but he'll try to balance those, audit them, whatever you want to say, and can provide feedback from a legal perspective at a later time. Do we have additional ground to cover today? I'm not trying to nip the meeting off here. If you all want to keep going, I'm here.
I think at this point in time, we can sit and argue points all day long, but ultimately, we each need to review the other's data so that we can compare and have a full perspective of what's going on. And then at that point in time, I think our next meeting is Wednesday, if I remember correctly?
Yes. Now, Wednesday, we can set the agenda however you all would like. Wednesday is really meant to be an organizational meeting for our community meetings that are coming up. So we'll want to cover some ground there Wednesday, how we're going to organize ourselves. Janice and I and Anna in my office have been working on what we think you all will want for sort of, informational tables, kiosks, whatever you want to call them. I'd like to deliver those ideas to you. You can add to them or subtract from them if you want. Sort of dictate how those meetings are gonna run. You know, our first two are Saturday, so we're.
Do we have a projected location for those meetings on Saturday?
Yes,
You know what they are?
Janice, can you confirm for us?
Precinct 1 will be at Goodnight Middle School, 10 a.m.
Okay.
What time?
10 a.m. The 10 to noon will be, that's the Precinct 1, Goodnight Middle School. It'll be in the cafeteria there.
Mark, will Janice send all this information out to us?
Yes,
Yeah,
not,
I'll send it to you as well.
Oh,
And then the afternoon, the Precinct 2 meeting will be from 1 to 3, and that will be at the Jack C. Hayes High School.
I assume in the cafeteria
In
on
the
both.
cafeteria on both of those,
occasions.
yeah.
Sorry, when is that? At what time?
1 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
1 to 3.
Have you looked at those rooms to see if there's seating that an adult
Their
can sit?
cafeterias, I think they both have all the seatings in there, so there's,
I went to a middle school meeting one time where the chairs were about
oh,
6 inches off the floor.
one's a middle, one's a high school, I think we're probably safe.
Bob, you might want to bring a folding chair just in case.
And Wednesday is a virtual meeting?
Wednesday's virtual. The following week, we have evening meetings on the Wednesday and the Thursday, Precinct 3 and 4 respectively. Precinct 3 is the
Community Center in Wimberley.
and Precinct
That's
4
seven.
is the Ranch Park.
Dripping Springs Ranch, yeah.
Okay.
We've tried to find
Where is 4?
spaces that are large enough to accommodate any numbers.
Oh, the Ranch Park?
Now, we have another virtual meeting right after those meetings on the Friday afternoon
At 2.
at 2 o'clock. Yeah, and that's just sort of, round things out, talk about what we heard and saw, have you all see if you can draw some conclusions on map proposals, because, bless you. Again, in order for the Commissioners Court to remain on time here toward the end of this month, we will be advertising that and publishing in the paper, which is a requirement, that they will vote on redistricting maps or map on November 9th. I would like to provide them with some information for consideration, for conversation and whatnot on the 2nd, if we can, but that'll be up to you all.
So you're saying the 27th and the 28th was our public meetings, and then the 29th would be a virtual meeting?
Virtual meeting, correct. And all of that has been sent out to you all, except for the locations for the community meetings, which we just established.
And what's the format for the public hearing?
The community meetings, I think, agreed in the last meeting that I call it the TxDOT model because I've seen them do it. It's more of a circulation. People don't have to show up and hear a presentation. I find that, especially with this kind of information that we're talking about here, they feel like oftentimes that they're just sort of getting it jammed down their throats, and that there's not really a conversation for a community meeting. Sometimes we've done this with projects like developments that we want feedback on. We set up some stations and have people circulate through. Janice, maybe you can help me, but I'm happy to cover at least our broad idea. We can talk about it in a couple of days, but obviously there's a maps station that's very significant, and that's where I think people will spend a lot of time talking. We will try to have large format maps printed. I think Steve said he could have that done, Steve Floyd said you could have these produced by weekend, hopefully. Is that right?
Want to have something?
Okay. So, that's one station.
Somebody will need to send the phone cord.
Yeah, we can have that done, and I'll find the budget for it. I'm not sure that I've been given one for this, but we'll figure it out.
We have some, but it's not very flat.
Right. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. One station for comments is handy, you know, where people can sit down and have lined paper for comments. One station for resources, it could be legal/other. I may set up there, although I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to every question I get. We could have,
About the charter and about the,
I thought about having a station that's just sort of informational on the RAC, like who are you all, what do you do? Dr. Trahan, or no, actually Shannon, I believe you suggested that some information on what commissioners do, things like that might be helpful. So that could either be part of resources or it could be its own table. I don't want to spread us too thin where we don't have someone hanging around that table where that can maybe answer questions. But, you know, the idea is to have these stations set up and then somewhere near the beginning, either I or someone else would get up, introduce the RAC members present, introduce the elected officials that are present, and then let people circulate and have conversations. At some point, we would shut it down, move on. We only have an hour between the Precinct 1 and the Precinct 2 meeting, so we'll need to shut it down and move everything pretty quickly at some point. What's that?
And set it back up.
And set it back up. I think we can, you know, some of these resource tables, we can create duplicate information and have it already there. But the maps, since we're trying to get it put on phone core and all that, we'll have to probably move those during that hour in between.
I guess I would think that would depend, because if we're focusing, for instance, Precinct 1, Precinct 2, et cetera, I would think that we would have a special map which would show Precinct 1 by itself and then the county as a whole, and then the second one would be Precinct 2 by itself, the county as a whole, as incorporated within a map. So it's kind of an extraction from that standpoint. So that we could even have special maps for each one. It'd be 4 maps, but...
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think we could have a more detailed map that shows that precinct, and then of course.
So that you could see a more geographic.
Yeah, I like that. I think that would be very helpful to that, residents of that precinct.
Yeah, the precinct map would be bigger, and the county map would be a little bit smaller, so they can see where it fits in. So it's like an extraction.
Right.
You bet.
The question that I have about that is how many maps are we taking out to the community?
That's
Well, right now we have 2. Obviously we have the existing precincts that I think is an important map to have available as well. Now I've had that on my wall for the last 10 years, so I can provide. We can maybe do it, and that one's on phone core already, so we won't have to spend the money on it. But, you know, if we've received 2 map proposals that are not produced by you all. One of them I think is not viable. It was just a citizen proposal. Just taking a quick gander at it, it didn't look viable to me. It didn't look like it satisfied the first rule, which is balancing the precincts and population. The other was provided by the League of Women Voters in a long letter with map attached. I just had a conversation with Janice this morning about that we would provide that to you all, and we'll incorporate it into a comments section on the website. But I don't think that it's appropriate that I bring a large format of a map proposal that isn't one of y'all's, because this is about the RAC's, you know, sort of collective communication with the community here. And I don't want you to have to be asked questions about or defend a map that isn't your own. So
Mark, for these presentations, we're currently submitting them to Allison Bass McGee to see that they meet the Voting Rights Act. So if either map varies from that, as long as it's not illegal, then we can discuss that. But if it's something that's a clear violation of the Voting Rights Act, then we have to reshuffle and straighten that out based on the legal analysis. Is that correct?
I think that if Bob said he didn't think, in his legal opinion, he didn't think it could be defended from any legal aspect, that we would need to retool that map and see if we can bring it into compliance. And I think we all agree with that, right?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. You know, obviously we don't know that until he's done the analysis, but we will know before Saturday, and
Hopefully we know before Wednesday.
I think we will.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what his schedule is, but yeah. Steve can look at it too and establish an opinion.
That seems like that's going to be the key, is his legal analysis.
Yeah.
And then we can decide on how to meld it together or keep them separate, or however we want to do that from there.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Right, anything else?
Sounds like we discussed for the most part.
It sounds like what?
It sounds like we've discussed for the most part what we needed for the Saturday, so really, hopefully, we can spend the majority of our time
Talking about the map.
talking about the map.
I think we can do
Wednesday.
both. As late as you all want to go, we will go.
It sounds like you're gonna present an excellent basis from which we can add or subtract, but I think it sounds very complete, and it's gonna provide the information that's necessary. As long as we can get all those resources there, that's what I wanna see.
Janice is going to do it all, and and if it goes poorly, it's going to be her fault. If it goes well, I'll take credit for it.
If I may, before we break, I'd just like to thank all the members of the RAC, Dr. Trahan. I think this has been a very informative session for all of us. I know everybody's worked very hard on their maps and their numbers, and staff, I truly appreciate your diligence in all this process. And I got to thank the judge for letting us use his courtroom here. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Done.
Are we rolling rules, or are we just done?
So it's a workshop.